All right, everyone can see that? Okay, so what I'm going to talk about today is really, I hope, of interest to everybody. I just thought Shelby has given you a little bit of a background, so this is just no point to go through it again. It just sort of tells you, some of the things that I've been up to in my consulting with regulators across the country. And I am, just to the last point, I have been involved in conducting a number of external regulatory and regulatory governance reviews. And I only will say that because I will a little bit later talk about some of the findings that emerge that are kind of common across different reviews that are done, which I think you'll find of interest. So what I wanted to talk a little bit about tonight is just self-regulation in Canada, what our model is, and why I believe that it's such a privilege to have the model that we have. I want to really leave you with that at the end of tonight. Talk a little bit about regulating in the public interest and what that means, what I think it means. As a regulator, what sort of does our focus need to be? And more importantly, what about our accountabilities? And then sort of bring it all together for you, talk a little bit about some of the trends that we see happening, not only in Canada, but internationally with respect to regulators. So self-regulation, and I really do, I think it came across in Shelby's introduction, but it is something that I feel quite passionate about. And as I said, I think our model that we have here in Canada is really a privilege. It's not a right. It is a privilege, and it's a privilege that has been lost. And I'm going to share a little bit about that because I did have some experience with a regulator that lost its privilege in Ontario. And so I really think that it's a privilege and not a right. And when you think about that privilege, here's some of the hallmarks of self-regulation that I want to highlight for you. Some of you may or may not know that in Canada, we really are unique in the sense that our professions or occupations still have the right to elect members of the profession or occupation onto their boards or the councils. And you also may be interested in knowing that that is not the case in most other leading jurisdictions around the world. So in the US, in the UK, in Australia, New Zealand, and with some exceptions in Ireland, everyone who ends up on regulatory councils are appointed, in both public members and professional members. So the fact that we still have our electoral model, I think, is a privilege, and it's one of our hallmarks. The other is that we have the ability to discipline our own members. So right now we have discipline panels that are made up usually with professional majorities. And again, that's something that is different in other jurisdictions where they have discipline panels that sometimes they're not only independent from regulatory councils, but are actually independent from the regulators themselves. And then the last point is important, and we have the autonomy to say, this is what we need to do as a regulatory board. This is how much we need to do it, and therefore our regulatory fees need to be X. And so we have the right to set, collect, and use registrant fees, and we have autonomy over those three things. So I think it does mean we have a privilege to regulate ourselves, but it also means that we have a responsibility to live up to that trust that we are going to demonstrate that we have the ability to regulate ourselves. And as the night unfolds, you'll sort of see that there's some instances where I think we regulators have run into issues and under a lot of scrutiny and under a lot of public and media attention. So I want to sort of raise that with you a little bit later. I think the last point is really important because we hold our members accountable. So there was a regulator, we set and enforce standards and rules, and we have to hold our members accountable for meeting those, but we also have accountabilities. So I'm going to talk a little bit about that with you tonight too. So regulating in the public interest, this is something that we hear a lot, and it isn't something that we just decide to do. For all regulators and all regulatory sides of associations that have both mandates, the regulatory side, it actually is a statutory obligation to put public interest above all other interests. And that's where I think our challenges come sometimes as a regulatory body. So I think as regulators, the way we demonstrate that is by, every time we consider an issue, we put public interest, say, well, where's the public interest consideration or rationale for doing this? And making sure that we've talked about it and that it's there, and then communicating why we're doing what we're doing. And being a really effective regulatory organization does require managing those competing interests, professional self-interest, public interest. And as I hope I'm going to show you a little bit later, there are many areas where they do intersect. So what's in the public interest is often in the profession's interest too. And if we can be most effective in trying to figure out how they intersect and work together towards those goals, I think we're going to be most successful. So some of the things that I think challenges us as regulators, I would say the higher costs of self-regulation. And it's very costly to regulate a profession or occupation today. And I think, having been in the regulatory arena since Shelby mentioned 1994, things have changed. There's a lot more responsibilities and expectations that are put on us as regulators and things that we need to meet. So, when I was the supervisor with the denturist, which was in Ontario, by Ontario standards, one of the smaller regulators, I think they had 580 registrants at the time. And one of the challenges that they had was that they were not collecting enough fees to be able to do all the things that they needed to do. And as a regulator, the expectations are the same on everyone, whether you have 600 registrants or whether you have 16,000 like we had in pharmacy. So there is a cost to it. I think that's a real challenge. Under scrutiny and attention, you'll see a lot of regulators end up praying that we're not going to be on the front page of a major paper, being grateful when it's someone else and not us, but also being thoughtful about the fact that if a regulator does end up on the front page of a paper, we kind of all get looked at through the same lens. So it affects everybody. And that has, I think, collectively led to what is widely thought to be maybe a sense of waning public trust and confidence in, can the professions be trusted to regulate themselves? So this is something that challenges us when we're looking to be effective and credible regulators. Now, you talked a little bit about balancing those competing interests. And what I think it means is, having respectful and cooperative relationships with different stakeholder groups, but always making sure that all of us stay in our lanes so that, even with advocacy side, regulatory side, it doesn't mean that we can't agree on certain things. But if we agree on things all the time, then we probably have a problem. And I did mention about where professional and public interests intersect, and I'm going to share flesh those out with you in a few minutes. So if we look at public interest and what I think it means from different perspectives, for us as a regulator, I think it means that we ensure and we say to the public that anyone who is on our register, who's a registered dental hygienist in Saskatchewan, has satisfied our requirements coming into the profession, that we feel confident that they are qualified to provide safe and competent care. We set and enforce our standards. We hold our registrants accountable. And I think it's also the quality assurance piece or continuing competence piece. It's not just making sure someone can provide safe and competent care when they come into the profession, but that they're able to do so the whole time that they're on our register. And so I think that those are really important pieces for us. Government is sort of oversees our work. We are established by statute, so we are sort of children of statute, if you will. But government generally is a hands-off, but they do hold us accountable. We have to make annual reports. They have the right to ask a regulatory council to make a regulation, and they look to us to put public interest first and demonstrate how we do that. And there's different oversight accountabilities around across the country, and I'm going to talk a little bit about that at the end when I look at what's happening in other jurisdictions. So I think the public really wants and expects to be treated fairly. They want to be informed as to what's going on. If someone were to file a complaint against a dental hygienist with the regulatory body, they want to know where is their complaint, what's happening with it, not just that it goes into a big black hole and never comes out the other side, but they want to be kept apprised and want to know what's going on. And there was a study that was done by the dentists in Ontario, the Royal College of Dental Surgeons, who went and surveyed past complainants who had made complaints to the college about dentists, and asked them, you know, what were you looking for? What were your expectations? Were the expectations met? And what came out very, very strongly and commonly was that the public really expects us to have their backs. You know, if there's something goes wrong, they want some redress. They want to know that we will investigate it, and they want to know that we'll keep them informed as to why we made the decisions we make. Now, the profession, you know, this slide I think is really important, because if you look at the evolution of regulators sort of through the times, you know, we came from the guilds in 14th century England. So if you think about where our roots came from, we all came from advocacy, you know, the guilds where they were set up to take care of workers and make sure that they, you know, their interests were made, they got paid for what they did. But as things started happening, they started to take in a regulatory sort of bench, you know, as something started to go wrong, people started to complain, well, who's going to look after that? So we sort of have evolved through the years, but to the point now where, you know, the best practice is now that there's clear separation from the professional regulatory side and from the advocacy side. And I'll flesh that out with you in a few minutes as well. I think that professional and self-interest is not at all a bad thing. I mean, we all come by it naturally, it's human nature, but we have to make sure as the regulator that we manage those interests. And as I said, we always try and find out, where do the interests intersect? And sometimes we can work on the same things, but as a professional regulatory body, we have to go about it one way, and the advocacy body would go about it a different way. So here's where I think what's in the public interest is equally in the profession's interest. So I think CPD, continuing competency, it's just as much in the profession's interest that the whole profession is being held to a certain expectation that throughout time, as someone is on the register, they're not only going to keep competent, but their competency is also going to evolve with changing expectations, with you know, changing scopes of practice. The public wants that, the profession wants it too. Looking at ways, you know, to increase access to necessary healthcare services. Very important. Access to care is an important thing. It's something we can all work on together. But from the regulatory side, it's really about looking at, is this something that our professionals can do safely and competently? It isn't about how much they're going to get paid or status. It's about public protection, but it doesn't mean we can't both work on it. And so I mentioned about timeliness, transparency. Everyone wants to know that. If we get a complaint, both parties want to be treated fairly. Both parties want to be treated in a timely manner, and everyone wants to know what's going on in a transparent manner. So these are all important pieces that I think intersect our interests. So I've already mentioned this, but globally there is clearly best practice that it's separate, clearly separate and distinct. Advocacy is one initiative on one side, and regulatory is separate and distinct. So I want to talk a little bit, I mentioned about accountabilities, because I said that, you know, we not only hold our registrants accountable, but we are accountable as well. So these are some of the things that I just am going to go through really quickly with you. So how we structured ourselves, I think impacts our ability to serve and protect the public interest well. So you'll see that when we talk about the evolution of how regulatory bodies have evolved, I mean, you know, for many years it was only professional, self-professional regulation. There was no public members appointed to regulatory councils. However, now we're seeing an increase in public members being appointed to regulatory councils, so that regulation in the public interest is truly seen as a partnership between with both public and professional participation. And the capacity to do what we want and need to do, we have to be able to support the human and financial resources that we need to be effective and credible as regulators. And as I said, there is a cost to it, but we have to make sure that capacity is in place. So internal accountabilities, this is how we govern ourselves. What's our governance model like? Is everyone clear about who does what, the roles and responsibility? There has to be kind of a clear understanding that the staff, is in charge of the operations side, and the councils are in charge of the high level, setting the directions and then giving it over to staff to do it. Operational controls have to be in place, HR controls, financial controls. Those are really important. And we have financial statements and, as I said, annual reports. Externally, we have a real obligation as regulators to make sure that we not only build, but we also maintain appropriate relationships and boundaries with all of our stakeholders. And again, there is no reason why there has to be undue or really negative tensions between the advocacy and the regulatory sides. In my experience in pharmacy, we were able to work very successfully together, not collaboratively, but respectfully and cooperatively. And as I said, many times you can find where there's a common sort of intersection of interest, even though you have to work around it differently, you can work together on the same things. I think the messages we send, using public interest language quite a lot. We have to be not only just say we're here for the public interest, but we have to demonstrate it. And so how we demonstrate that to our stakeholders is really important. Our programs and processes, we all have statutory programs that we're meant to have under the legislation. So these are things like registration. These are things like quality assurance or continuing competency. Those are things that tend to be more provincial, and they can vary from province to province. But then there's the federal legislation that kind of affects all of us as regulators of any occupation and profession. Those are labor mobility, free movement of goods and services across the country, including professional services. The Competition Bureau, all professions and occupations, looking at advertising, false and misleading advertising or anti-competitive advertising. So we're all subject to that. And then we have privacy commissioners, not only in our provinces, but we also have federal privacy laws. So those are things that we all have to be aware of and we're accountable for. To our professionals, we have a fiduciary duty, to not only do what's in the best interest of the public, but also to make sure that we collect enough resources, but we spend them appropriately as well. So, there's a value proposition. We collect our money from our registrants, and we're accountable as to how we spend it. I think we have circulation and consultation requirements, and if it isn't something that's actually required in the law, it's something that I think we have an obligation to do. So we should be consulting not only with the profession, but with the public too, on anything that we approve as a council that will impact them. So if it impacts our member practice, if it impacts the public, we should get some consultation going with both of those groups. Open council meetings. Best practice is that we don't hide behind the cloak of confidentiality, that we have our council meetings in the public domain. And I would say certainly in Ontario, all of the council meetings are in the public domain. They are in British Columbia as well. And I think that the thinking is, if there isn't some compelling reason to keep something private, why wouldn't we put it out in the public domain? So there's always an ability to go in camera or into an executive session, which is a closed meeting to discuss certain things. But other than that, best practice would say they should be open. And same with discipline hearings. In many jurisdictions, including Ontario, discipline hearings are open to the public. And I mentioned the elections to council. I really think this is a privilege. I think it's a privilege that, is certainly under some scrutiny. In British Columbia, the new changes that are happening in BC, there will be no more elections to health regulatory councils. They'll all be through appointments. And at the College of Teachers, the Ontario College of Teachers already has gone through a transformative legislation change that has taken them away from elections, and everyone is appointed to council. So I think that that is something that we enjoy and appreciate right now, but I think it's something that is under scrutiny. So again, the public, we can demonstrate our accountability to the public by having our meetings open. They can attend discipline hearings. We have a public register, and I think what's really important here is to be accountable to make sure that we give the public the information that they need to know to be able to make an informed decision. So particularly if someone is going onto our register to say, is there a practitioner that I would like to use? They go in and they have enough information that they should be able to make an informed decision as to whether or not they would want to, may want to use a particular practitioner. I think access to the regulators is really important. And then of course, I already mentioned consistency and fairness. So the government, again, as I said, they hold us sort of accountable. We do annual reports. We have now in a number of provinces, we have Office of the Fairness Commissioner, which is really overseeing the registration practices to make sure that they're transparent, objective, impartial, and fair. And I think the other thing that I would say about the government is that most of the new regulated health professions acts that have been enacted over the last, I would say, 10 years have included some sort of provision which allows the government to put in some supervisory authority or to take over the authority of a regulatory body in the event that there are severe or really significant issues. And it was under these powers in Ontario that I went in as a supervisor to the College of Denturists, which lost its privilege to regulate itself back in 2012. So that is something that we're seeing, which we probably, when I joined the College of Pharmacists in 1994, I would never have been ever anticipated that they'd have those sort of provisions, but we have them now. So when we say public interest is our first concern, this is only to sort of say why sometimes it isn't so apparent. Like we can talk public interest, we can use the language, but it does sort of look to the public sometimes. You say, well, you say that, but the discipline decisions or the complaints decisions are made by panels that have public professional majorities. You might have a public member, but it's really the professions making decisions about themselves. Your professionals run on a platform that they think is going to get them elected onto the council, but not one that might mention public interest. And I have to say on this one, having been with the college I was with for almost 20 years, I honestly can't ever think that I saw a letter from or any campaign material that said, if you put me on this council, I'm going to put the public interest above professional interest. People just don't say that. And that kind of causes us to be under that microscope a little bit more in a bit of a skeptical way, I think. And there are a lot of pressures to, cloak things. We can almost say everything is in the public interest, but we have to be very, very careful as a regulator to not cloak something that's clearly a professional interest argument as public interest, because then people do see through that very quickly and our reputation can really suffer. So I think the public is not always clear how our decisions benefit them as a regulator. And I think that hiding sometimes behind that cloak of confidentiality can also lead to some skepticism. So I think where the potential for challenges lie, I think conflicts of interest and conflicts of role. There's not a bad thing to have conflicts arise, but it is a bad thing if we don't declare them, if we don't address them, manage them, and then even record that it was managed. So I'll give like an example. Conflict of interest is really where something that you or your family members or someone close to you might be benefiting from or be perceived to be benefiting from a way the particular vote might go. And conflict of role is where it might not be a conflict of interest, but by a role that you or a family member or someone close to you, a business partner holds, could someone else perceive that there's a conflict of interest? So, we have to be really diligent about this, because from a reputational risk, I think our reputation as regulatory sides can really be affected if we don't deal with conflicts. The inability to keep our necessary relationships intact. We make very difficult decisions as regulatory bodies, and sometimes the decisions are not always palatable with everybody. And we have to be able to make those hard decisions that we need to make, but keep our necessary relationships in a good place. Because if we have been successful in doing what we need to do, but all of our relationships broke down, which they did at the denturist, that's what happened. I mean, the relationships broke down at almost every level of that organization, inside and out, then you can't really be successful. So that's, I think, a real challenge for us. And once you lose public confidence and trust, the road to winning it back is extremely difficult. And I always sort of think of it as a bit of our credit rating. And one thing my dad always told my siblings and I is how important that credit rating is. And that when you build it, you want to keep it, because if you lose your credit rating, it's hard to get it back. Reputation as a regulator is very much the same. Some of the things I think that we have to really be careful to avoid as regulators: reimbursement issues, funding issues, employment issues. These are things that the Advocacy Association has to deal with. Those are absolutely things that need to be taken care of, but as a regulator, we have to be very careful about not being involved in those. Competition issues. The only time I think I've seen regulators really weigh in here is with advertising regulations. It's certainly in the profession's interest, but also in the public interest, that whatever advertising our professionals do, that it's true advertising, that it isn't something that is false or could mislead the public. And so I know the Competition Bureau sometimes says, well, competition issues should be left totally to the association, but I think we have a role with false and misleading information that might cause harm, potential or risk of harm to the public. I think we need to be, very clear in our decisions. And I think the best practice that I'm seeing, certainly at the colleges, some of the colleges now in Ontario have started putting right in their briefing notes that go to the council and in their reports that go to the council, what are the public interest considerations in this? Or if they're looking at standards of practice, for example, are there potential risks of harm to the public if we don't have this standard? Are there any potential risks if we do? And I think putting it right in the report is so that it's there and is transparent and people can see that we consider these things is a really, I think, important and a good practice. So what's not in the public interest, I think it's almost easier to define, but I will just say again, and I think back to, some of the regulators that have really struggled or even lost their privilege, cloaking an action as a public interest when clearly it's in the profession's interest. Government sees through it, media sees through it, the public and the profession sees through it, and we have to really watch, because I think it creates a very significant risk for us. So I talked about the privilege of self-regulation being lost. Lawyers and teachers in the UK and in British Columbia have lost their privilege. So in the UK, there's no regulatory body for teachers, nor is there one now in BC. And the problems that both lawyers and teachers had that led to this was either the perceived unwillingness or inability of the regulators to demonstrate a clear and separate function from the advocacy side, or in the lawyer and teacher side, the unions. Engineers in Quebec, real estate brokers in BC, and the one, of course, that I can speak to most personally is the denturists in Ontario, which lost its privilege in 2012 and got it back 2 years later. So some of the issues, and these were all present in the denturists, but if you read the Payton report on the College of Dental Surgeons of BC, some of these will resonate. Conflicts of interest, conflicts of role not being addressed, not being managed, not being declared. Concerns about the way the colleges were run, operations, financials, lack of controls. In the denturist case, there was certainly capacity. They weren't collecting enough money to do all the things that they needed to do. Relationships were broken down at all different levels. And you could see this in the two examples that I mentioned, but certainly with the denturist, there were relationship breakdowns among council members, between council members and the staff, between the college and the professions, between the college and other colleges, with the education bodies, and with other denturist colleges across the country. So very, very difficult. I would say the first year that I was in as a supervisor, much of my time was spent trying to get those relationships rebuilt and back on track. And then governance concerns, we have to really be thoughtful about how we govern ourselves. And, in a very simple level, just making sure that everyone is clear at who does what, that the council sets the directions and then the staff gives effect to those. And to do anything other than that, can get us into some trouble. So some of the recent external reviews, and I mentioned them, I've been involved in a few of them, either with Harry Caton or by myself. But these are some of the findings that have come out, and they seem to be pretty consistent themes that have emerged. So, you have to have your roles and responsibilities, and we have to know why we exist as a regulator. And there's a very good TED Talk by a fellow named Simon Sinek, who does something called the Golden Circle and says, if the public doesn't really understand why we exist, then what we do or how we do it doesn't really matter. So I think that always resonates with me, and I think it's really important. Larger boards are not necessarily more effective than smaller ones. One thing that I can tell you is absolutely true is that good governance is as much about behaviors as it is about the processes that you follow. So you can have all the processes in the world, but if the behaviors aren't appropriate or good, then it can cause some issues. The other is that geographical representation on a council does not contribute to effective regulatory governance. And there's really no evidence that having elections from different geographical parts of, everyone wants representation, but it isn't the representation that makes regulatory councils effective. It's competence and its skills. And so to have a good mix of skilled and competent members of a board to make it collectively most effective is what really makes effective governance. And then transparent accountability for what we do and why we do it. So not just doing it, but actually communicating why we're doing this. So one of the best practices that I think exists is in the UK, where because all of the disciplinary decisions are scrutinized by an oversight body called the Professional Standards Authority, many of the health regulators in the UK now put a little section in their discipline decisions that say, these are the things we considered when we were considering this matter. And this is why our panel believes that these are the best decisions or actions to take going forward in the public interest. And I think it really clarifies everything for everybody, including the professional member who's also getting that decision. So I think that I've already talked about this. So let me talk a little bit about some of the trends that we're seeing. And so when you look at governance and some of the modernization trends that we're seeing, and think about British Columbia, some of this is happening, I think, in Ontario. We've seen some in Nova Scotia to some degree, and I think we're seeing it across the country in various dispatches. One is terminology changes. So moving away from councils to boards, from presidents to chairs, vice presidents to vice chairs, not calling people members, not registrants, not members, to make it clear. So some of those things are small little things, but they're trends that we're seeing happen. Smaller size councils, and it may not be a big issue for you, but I can tell you in Ontario, some of the councils were ridiculously large. And in pharmacy, as a matter of fact, I had 35 people on my council at pharmacy. I had 17 pharmacy professionals. We had 16 public members, because in Ontario, we have a 49% public, 51% professional mix. And then we had 2 academic appointments. And I can tell you it's very difficult to be effective as far as time goes when you have 35 people on your council. So, smaller council sizes is certainly where I think best practice lies. Assuring skills and competence on your regulatory councils, and not just in the people who govern, like the councils, but also in people who chair meetings, because it's a special skill. And so having special chair training or people who have skills as chairs is really a benefit. Now, statutory processes being independent of the council, that is because of the concern that exists at times. And we saw this in a few colleges, where if someone were sitting on a college council and worried about the finances, and they had a matter come before a complaints committee, and thinking that, maybe this is going to cost an awful lot of money, and how are we going to deal with this at finance if it's a long contested hearing? So is there a different way? Maybe we shouldn't refer it to discipline. Maybe we should try dealing with it somewhere else. And whether or not that happens, sometimes there's a perception that happens. And so there's a very strong feeling sort of internationally, that statutory processes like complaints and discipline, if you sit on those committees, you should not sit on the regulatory council or on the finance committees. And so what we're seeing, I think, in British Columbia is that these processes are going to not only be taken away from the councils, but actually will be separate and independent through a separate tribunal that's independent of the regulators themselves. And then cooling off periods. So this was something that has been a recognized best practice for a long time. If someone comes on to a regulatory board, they should not have been on the board of the association for at least 2 years, or maybe even 3. So that gives, to come down from that advocacy mindset and then sort of switch over to, now we have to put the public first. And these are just some of the trends that we're seeing. Now, regulatory trends are a little different than governance, because it's not about how we govern. It's really about how the professions are regulated. So some of these, you see the move to multi-professional regulators. And certainly in the UK, there's the Health and Care Professions Council, which has actually 16 different professions, health and care professions, under one regulator. We have Corru in Ireland, which has 15 different health and care professions. And we're going to see, once the legislation is proclaimed, we're going to see 2 multi-professional regulators in British Columbia. But I think this is a trend. There's the thought, does everyone really need to have their own regulatory body? And a lot of it does come back to that capacity. Is there more efficiencies and effectiveness that can be gained through multi-professional regulation? 50-50 professional and public members seems to be the gold standard internationally. So you're going to see that in British Columbia. They were already seeing it at the Ontario College of Teachers. Ireland is the only jurisdiction that I'm aware of in the world that requires 51% public representation and 49% professional, and that's in the health professions in Ireland. The regulatory performance, holding regulators accountable through some sort of a demonstrated evaluation processes. So in Ontario now, we have what they call the College Performance Measurement Framework, where the college's performance at how effective are the regulators in meeting their mandate to put public interest first. It's quite an exhaustive tool, but it is a report that's generated by every health regulatory college every year, and the reports are put on the website along with the college's plans for the next year to try and meet areas where they weren't able to meet or fully meet in the year before. Professional Standards Authority in the UK actually does regulatory reviews of all of the health regulators and publishes those. And so this is something that is coming, like, how different governments are holding regulators accountable varies, but I think that is a trend that we're seeing. And then this is a slide I really like, because I think that we need to really keep an eye on what's happening elsewhere. And, a lot of these trends were happening outside of Canada for a number of years, but now they're happening in Canada, and we have to keep an eye on what's happening in BC, because these are things that our governments are looking at. So I always say, if change is coming, you really do want to be at the front end of change, trying to anticipate and trying to be able to somehow, shape or manage what's going. I'm sorry, Shelby, did you have your hand up? No.
Nope, everything is good from my end.
Oh, okay, sorry. Okay. So some of the learnings, about what happens elsewhere, I think that we need to learn from some of the mistakes that some of the other regulatory bodies have made. When I have to say, the denturists, there was a PricewaterhouseCoopers report, an audit report that was done on behalf of the ministry before they made the decision to put a supervisor in there. And when I read that report, having run a fairly large and I think very functional regulator at the Ontario College of Pharmacists, what I realized is that when you looked at the things that were that were flagged in this audit report, and I think if you look at the College of Dental Surgeons in BC report, you'll find the same, is that some of the things that that they struggled with, all regulators struggle with. It's just that at the College of Denturists, all of those things kind of happened at once. So I think we need to figure out what are some of the things that can cause regulators to get into trouble, and then how do we avoid it, and what mechanisms can we put into place to make sure that we're very effective. And I think we do have to work harder today in today's world to show that we value that privilege and that we can be trusted to put the public interests above our own and work together for the safety of the public.